Okay, I've been asked to start from the beginning. And I want to say, for the benefit of the people that weren't here at the start, the story, The Dahlia Field, was written partly as a response to my seeing the AIDS quilt a number of years ago when it came to Eugene. And by the way, Robot Monster has been noted as probably the worst movie ever made. So and the moment I mentioned that, that's when the bell went off. The Dahlia Field. Times when in high school, looking out on a late afternoon, I would enter that brick-lit life of deserted curbs in the city, newspapers blowing under cinder blocks at newsstands without no one seeing, and would wonder what it was like to be lonely. Up until then, I had lived in a world full of holidays, of troops of people talking in a festooned dining room, the plates of food and golden candles steaming up the windows, and the piano competing with the din. I was naive and forward and outgoing, and yet 30 years later, being single and retired and scared, I'd entered what I observed through that glass, a continually framed picture of inanimate objects. My greatest friends were the birds seen from my kitchen. We communicated. They flew in the feeder, creating a sign language that I immediately understood, a burst of wings that were sometimes red, sometimes copper. On their side, they had grown so used to my movements, very quiet, that even an angry cracking open of the newspaper could send them flying. The birds had become my flowers, for in allowing my life to shrink down on all sides, I had let my garden go as well, not to rack and ruin, but just sealed over by the grass, which, one spring, simply spread over the beds and formed a wall-to-wall carpet in my backyard. I was getting up later and later those days, and I thought whimsically one morning in the kitchen window that maybe the grass had taken advantage of me while I was asleep. Yes, let life narrow itself down. Let my walks and my bus rides get shorter and shorter. Let my grocery list be reduced to the fewest and most essential lines. I had served my part in this world, and now let it be taken over by those who could better understand a late century whose complexity and speed increased every hour on the hour. I can't remember how I first heard about Aerosmith, dying of AIDS, confined to a nursing home. How was it possible? I had been disconnected from almost all associations for years. It was the kind of thing you hear about through the grapevine or at a church when a call for general concerns goes out. Nevertheless, I heard. Maybe the birds had sent me a message in the heliograph of the sun. I thought about him, Aerosmith, for a long time, how he belonged to some old days that had caused heavy bitterness for both of us. He would not be glad to see me. Maybe not even glad that I thought about him. We had done some scientific work together, but I had never suited him, never accurate enough. At first he had been light about my mistakes. Later he had grown severe and caustic, especially after we became lovers. He always seemed to eclipse my life, diminish it. He scored so well in the male department. He was middle-aged and good-looking, the winner of awards, and had an irresistible edge which had brought out many young men his way. For all his academe, he was built like a brick shithouse, so he could have won any Renaissance man beauty pageant in the fraction of a second. I wasn't jealous. Well, while I was busy beating a hasty retreat from this life, scurrying like one of my squirrels straight into my little 50s house, he seemed to be on just the brink of the new world, all his for the asking. But AIDS had him now, and my heart felt like a lead pendulum. I couldn't say why. The surprise of this wrung my heart because I had convinced myself, in being alone for so long, that I was no longer bothered by such things. Life for me meant birds who, when they died, were replaced by indistinguishable replicas. But now the news about Aerosmith had put everything in twilight. It was as though I had returned to my high school window, not just among those rose buildings and abandoned theaters, but also back in that very time itself, when I'd only wondered what it was like to be lonely. What a luxury only to wonder. Because I had had a home then, and then came back to me too because of Aerosmith. The news sent me back to my house of my high school days when things had been so happy, and there had been the sounds of people going back and forth in the kitchen, fuck the birds, throwing turkeys in the oven and having droves over for potluck in that festooned living room. After hearing about Aerosmith, I was traveling backwards in time into something larger. I realized the lawn wasn't meant to roll straight over me and my beds and my whole house. I was supposed to grow rather than shrink. So one morning the bird shaking the feeder which hung from the apple tree flashed me another message. A star of light hit me square in the face, and I got my coat and took the car out on tires grown flat from being in the garage too long. I was pretty breathless being in that car. God, the scenery comes at you so fast when you're driving, a whole big world like the clearing during a hike that brings the lake and the campsite at last. So much was happening all around me on this Sunday afternoon. And in Aerosmith's room, too, when I arrived, I was expecting to find him just lying there ready to vanish beneath all the sheets. But I found him the center of a whole field of activity once I got beyond the door. His entire family was clustered there, all wearing 3D glasses and watching Robot Monster. They were laughing with confetti voices and seemed to be in the middle of a parade. Apparently, soap bubbles were coming out of the screen, although for me, without glasses, it was hard to tell. Talk about odd man out. The fun stopped the moment they saw me. "Hello," he said. His brother, his sister, his mother all drew back. Robot Monster went straight off the tube. Only his lover remained near, casting a formidable shadow over the two of us, as Aerosmith and I shook hands. His palm was cold, and I saw then, with his 3D glasses off, how pale he was, how white his hair. "I can't stay long," I said, ready to jump out of my skin. I seemed to scare his family of origin straight out the door, leaving excuses behind. "It was good of you to come," he answered. "It's been at least 10 years. But to be honest with you, I can't remember what it was we did in the old days. Was it something important?" "I don't think so." The tension in the room led me to turn to his lover, who introduced himself. His hand swallowed mine. He still had his 3D glasses on. "For heaven's sakes, Wilbur," Aerosmith said, "take those things off. You look like an unintentional Martian." You must understand that Wilbur was quite young. "I'm curious, though," Aerosmith went on, "what it was we did, you and I." I thought to myself, we were lovers once. We wrote a major scientific article together. You had my name taken off. You got all the credit. It was an AIDS breakthrough. It might be leading to a cure and a vaccine as we speak. "I can tell you what we did," I said. "We were in the Dahlia Society together." "Oh, yes," Aerosmith said, as if he were asking and speaking of my family, "How are your dahlias?" "I don't have them anymore," I answered, as though speaking of a massive family loss, but I had to say something about them. Had to reacquire my niche in this world where families are happy and throw confetti and watch Robot Monster. "But," I said, "I do go out to a dahlia field occasionally. It's so beautiful, especially in late summer. I know the growers, they're like family." A dahlia field. He lay his head back on the pillow and rested. "What a wonderful picture. Tell me about this dahlia field." He had a hint of a British accent. "Yes," Wilbur said, interested in me for the first time. "Tell us." Well, there was no dahlia field, I thought, but I have gone this far. I have to follow up on my performance. The backyard birds kept circling in my head at almost a command and formed indentations of color. "It's on the out on the outskirts of town," I said, "a family-owned nursery, and when you get there, there's one row of double-A dahlias after another. The woman moonlights as an accountant, so everything is orderly. The emery palls strike you first. Their purple blooms are as big as sunflowers, and they track the sun. Then the Zorros, in all their reds, and the new Papagenos looking like parrots in their yellows and pinks. They move with the wind and seem to wave at you, and as far as the eye can see, there are crests of orange and white, as though if you were in an airplane, you might see a kind of sign language being formed on those acres." "How restful," Aerosmith said, his eyes shut. "How peaceful. Go on." "Yes," Wilbur said, "please." "Oh, I don't know," I answered. "There isn't much more to say, except that I always will remember, Aerosmith, how much you love those emery palls." "Yes," he said, tears coming from beneath his closed lids. "Yes, I remember. I used to put them out on our table before we'd have dinner." Wilbur looked alarmed. "Yes." Silence, with Wilbur turning to me like, "What have you done?" "Well," I said, taking the hint, "I must be going. I hope what I've said is all right." Wait a minute, Wilbur said, surprising me. "You must promise to come back." "Yes." Aerosmith had opened his eyes. "You don't get off that easy." "I've made up a little sign-up book," Wilbur said, lifting it as though he had done this many times. "People can write their names here and the time, so Aerosmith will know in case he sleeps through." I couldn't tell if I was being humored, so I said, of course, I will come again. But what had I meant when I had said that? I meant I had to go and find a dahlia field. That would wipe out the lie. Then I could come back with all more stories to tell. How strange to fright the freeway the next morning, just doing some guesswork based on an old memory. I knew I had seen such a place before. I began to look for magical numbers on the exits, took one, passed a sign that said, "You are now entering the next 26 miles." I seemed to be driving beneath a rainbow, for heavy rain had fallen and then cleared. But there it was, Davenport Growers, under the sun. I got out and stood at the fence, feasting on impressions to take back to Aerosmith. There were the Emery Pauls clocking the sun, the flamboyant Zorros riding herd over the rest, and the Papagenos seemed to be startling up in the sun in pinks and yellows and greens, as though they were overgrown peace roses set to flight and chattering. I don't know how long I stood there, but I do know this. I came back with the purchased bulbs in my car and with a recollected sight of a lost farmhouse just down the road. A lost farmhouse, Aerosmith asked the next time I saw him. What sort of lost farmhouse? His mind snagged on anything uneven, out of the ordinary. A farmhouse I have seen somewhere before, I answered. It's one I can't quite place. It was different, and it was important at one time. But let me go on. There is such peace as you move from row to row. You can hear the crackle of the old stalks from last fall, and it's as though there are different draperies of different colors as you move from acre to acre. Such relief now that I was no longer lying, such a feeling that I had a purpose being there visiting him. Through the days and weeks and months that followed, I came to visit again and again, and as AIDS got the best of Aerosmith and took away his voice, the nursing home acquired a greater silence. Times came, no one else, not even Wilbur, was around. Only a night nurse for whom I developed an affection, and who took my various blooms and put them in startlingly shaped vases. He's asleep now, Robert would say, but won't he be delighted to see these in the morning? It became my routine, my ritual, how I loved signing in on Wilbur's ledger, complete with time, hoping to find Aerosmith awake, which he really was, but I was always delighted to see my name below all the other people he had known and loved. For he had loved me once, that was clear. We had even lived together for a while, tried to make a go of it until our work at the lab had driven us apart. But there had been a time when he had arranged my Emery Pauls on the dinner table, and I had made his favorite meal for him, and we had held hands and made love and hugged in bed until early morning. But now, night after night, signing in, speaking to Robert, bringing flowers, and first from the growers and then from my yard, where he had gone through a year already, and the bulbs had bloomed from the spaces I had cleared, and then now touching Aerosmith's hand on the coverlet as instructed, I was gaining my days back. I was told he could hear me even if his eyes were closed, and he couldn't speak, so I talked. Told him about the dahlia field again, told him about my house, and gently about certain days I hoped he remembered that were the best I had ever known, except for these, because now in his silence, instead of cutting me down, he seemed to love me back. One night, the white shock that fell over his forehead looked more boyish than usual, and I launched my dahlia field to greater height. The birds have come, I said, and their shadows dart across all the reds and whites and yellows. They seem to weave the colors as the wind pushes the blooms to and fro. For a moment there is sun, then clouds, and then a giant glance of light coming forward. It seems to send the flowers up, as though, with the flocks, they are heading into the sky, which is now a dome of cloud-laced blue. I was about to continue, but someone touched my arm. It was Wilbur, pointing toward Aerosmith, whose eyes were wide open and full of tears. My former lover took each of our hands, pressed them, and then sank down into sleep once more. I was so happy because I was sure he would rest now, but Wilbur only looked at me solemnly. I shook my head. It could not be, but it was true. Soon Robert was there at the bedside asking us both to leave. I wandered out, not knowing what to do. At home, where living by myself had become so very comfortable again, I found myself completely desolate. And in the morning, awakening to the sound of the birds and the lingering impression of a dream of dahlias, I called to be absolutely sure. Yes, he had died and all the arrangements had been left to the family. So there I was again, remembering the time he had taken my hand just as I had been about to leave, and he had kissed it and said, "Thank you so much for coming." But then there were other times when his family had been present and he had treated me as if I hadn't been there at all. Aerosmith liked his coteries, his own soul societies, and that old cold, good-hearted himself, he could lock me out like a cold jailer if he wanted to. And so the door was shut with his death, but somehow not on me, for if it had shut on me, another door had opened. The birds confirmed that. They had another message. Go out and try again. So it was not long before I was venturing out in the car once more, this time driving to the old potluck group that Aerosmith and I used to belong to. This time it was being held out in the country. Picking up my plate and walking through a huge farmhouse, I shook hands with people I had once known and loved, but not seen in years. Why, it's been at least 6 months since I've seen you, one of them said, pumping my hand. Good to see you again. 6 months, I felt elated. Try 6 years. The potluck buzzed and rattled and shattered with the news of an AIDS breakthrough, one which Aerosmith and I had been partly responsible for. With one step, we would be on the verge of a treatment and a vaccine. But somehow, as I finished out my dinner, I didn't feel pressed to speak, to take credit. Rather, I let the whole place flame with the irony that Aerosmith had died from the very disease he might help save the world from. Let him have both fame and death. No, I had nothing more to say, because in my mind it all had to do with dahlias. We were, in fact, not far from the grower's field, and so it was not long before I was hugging many of the men goodbye, nearest and dearest brought back by many long years, and driving out to the chain-link fence of my dahlia field. Watching the emery palls in their magnificent purple, I wondered if I stood there long enough and still enough, would they be the ones to blink first, that is, visibly track the sun. But there was no time for that. Following out a memory of my talk with Aerosmith, I got back into the car and searched out that old farmhouse down the road and knocked. And when a seemingly strange man answered and I said who I was, he could only reply with, "Well, I'll be ding-dong, well, I'll be ding-dong," over and over again like a bell in a steeple, for he was a relative I had not seen in years, a stepbrother, one of the ones who had lived the bricklick life with me outside the window of that high school. "Well, I'll be ding-dong," he said. "I guess we both got miffed in some terrible way, but I can't remember for the life of me what it was about." "I have no idea either," I answered, still standing on the porch, but soon to be asked in. And now it's been several years since Aerosmith's death, and I no longer have just the birds for my companions, although they still send me messages. There are many, many other beings, including my stepbrother, who help me stay sighted. But I do remember that it was the robins, the sparrows, and the scarlet tanagers that first gave me the nudge toward that long-term existence called the Dahlia Field, which led me among so many people I love, and which will keep me in good stead when others and I eventually find ourselves bedded and listening in a room much like Aerosmith's. Thank you.